Hey adventurer, welcome back to the Weary Wanderer. Tonight, we're pinning on a tin star and taking a stroll through the dusty, dung-caked streets of Dodge City, Kansas, circa 1878. We're here to find out exactly why one of the most romanticized gigs in the American West, the town sheriff, was in reality a thankless, terrifying, and spectacularly awful job that most sane people wouldn't take on a bet. You've seen him in 100 paintings and 1,000 stories. The noble Dodge City Sheriff. You know the look. Standing tall in the middle of Front Street, thumbs hooked in his belt, eyes like chips of flint scanning the horizon with a determined gaze. He's the stoic, silent hero who single-handedly tames the West with nothing but a fast horse and a faster gun. But trust me, being a real town sheriff was nothing like that dime novel fantasy. In truth, it was less about noble duels at high noon and more about wading into a saloon at 1 a.m. to disarm a 200-pound cattle drover who is drunk, angry, armed to the teeth, and currently arguing with his own reflection. It was gut-wrenching, foul-smelling, insanity-eroding work, and for the poor soul unlucky enough to wear the star, it profoundly, comprehensively, and biblically sucked. So while we prepare to wade into the muck, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to The Weary Wanderer. It's a huge help. And let us know in the comments below. What's the most overrated heroic job you can think of? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, perhaps go and lock your front door, a simple luxury our sheriff could never truly rely on for peace of mind. Settle in, get comfortable, and prepare for a long, chaotic patrol on the meanest street in Kansas. Let's be perfectly clear about something from the outset. No one in the entire history of humanity has ever answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? With the answer, the official, legally mandated target for every drunk with a grievance in Dodge City, Kansas. This wasn't a calling. It was the bottom of a barrel. The town sheriff job was not a position you ascended to. It was a ledge you clung to when you'd fallen past everything else. To understand the kind of man who would willingly take this job, you have to understand the sheer, soul-crushing disappointment that was the American West for most of the people who went there. They were fed a steady diet of heroic tales and pamphlets promising land so fertile you could plant a nail at night and harvest a crowbar in the morning. They packed their meager belongings, said goodbye to everything they knew, and marched west toward a golden horizon. What they found, more often than not, was that the golden horizon was just a fancy term for a crippling combination of dust, debt, and death. Our future sheriff was one of these men. Perhaps he was a farmer from Ohio. He'd sunk his life savings into a plot of land in western Kansas that a fast-talking man in a suit swore was the next Eden. For one glorious season it almost was. He and his wife watched the green shoots of wheat push through the soil, and for the first time in their lives, they felt the dangerous, intoxicating flutter of hope. Then came the locusts. Not a few, not a swarm, but a biblical sky-blackening plague. A living, chewing cloud that descended upon his dream, and over the course of a single afternoon, devoured it down to the dirt. He was left with nothing but a mortgage on a patch of useless earth and the high-pitched, maddening echo of a billion tiny mandibles in his ears. That's the kind of man who ends up in Dodge City looking for work. Any work. Or maybe he wasn't a farmer. Maybe he wore the blue uniform at Antietam, or the gray one at Shiloh. For 4 years, his primary trade was the application of controlled violence. He learned how to sleep through artillery barrages, how to tell the difference between a flesh wound and a gut shot by the sound a man makes, and how to pack a friend's wound with dirty fingers while whispering lies about how he's going to be just fine. When the war ended, they handed him a few dollars, shook his hand, and sent him home, expecting him to seamlessly transition back into a civilized world he no longer recognized. He was a tool forged for a singular, brutal purpose, and now that purpose was gone. He was haunted by the quiet. He tried his hand at a dozen different jobs: carpentry, smithing, clerking. But his hands only remembered the reassuring weight of a rifle stock, and his ears were always listening for the snap of a twig that signaled an ambush. He was a man out of time, a ghost at the feast of peace. That's the kind of man who drifts towards a place like Dodge, where his grim skill set is, for better or worse, still in demand. Whatever his past, his early training for the role of sheriff wasn't a formal apprenticeship. It was a brutal, decade-long education in the school of hard knocks, a masterclass in misery taught across the vast, unforgiving classroom of the plains. While other men were learning trades and raising families, he was mastering the grim curriculum of survival. His toys weren't carved wooden soldiers. They were a well-oiled revolver and a skinning knife with a worn handle, tools he learned to disassemble and clean by feel in the dark. His playground wasn't a grassy town green. It was a windswept buffalo camp 100 miles from anywhere, a place that smelled perpetually of blood, wood smoke, and freezing mud. He learned that fun games included guess that sound in the dark and shoot it before it eats you, and the ever-popular don't die of dysentery today. His primary instructor in this unforgiving environment was, more than likely, a grizzled veteran of the frontier whose face looked like a poorly folded roadmap of a very bad part of the country. This wasn't a kind or patient mentor. This was a man whose vocabulary consisted mainly of grunts, curses, and dire warnings that usually came about 5 seconds too late to be useful. He taught through a method of pragmatic cruelty. He wouldn't tell you your canteen was low. He'd wait until you collapsed from dehydration and then kick you, muttering, "Check your water next time." He wouldn't warn you about the venomous snake in the woodpile. He'd watch you reach for a log, then sigh with profound disappointment as he handed you the whiskey and the knife to cut out the poison. It was a terrible, abusive way to learn, but it was effective. It burned away every shred of naivete, every soft edge, every hopeful assumption, until all that was left was a hard, cynical core of pure, reactive survival instinct. So when this man, this failed farmer, this haunted veteran, this graduate of the University of Suffering, finally limps into Dodge City, he's not looking for glory. He's looking for a wage. He walks past the saloons, the brothels, and the general store, and finds his way to the marshal's office. Inside, he finds his true mentor, the outgoing sheriff. This man is a portrait of exhaustion. He's maybe 40, but looks a hard 60. His left hand is missing the top 2 joints of its index finger. One of his eyes has a permanent, weary squint. He doesn't get up when our man enters. He just gestures with his chin towards a rickety chair. The job interview is short and devoid of pleasantries. "You know how to use that?" he asks, nodding at the pistol on our man's hip. "Yes, sir." "You ever killed a man?" A long pause. "Yes, sir." The sheriff gives a slow, tired nod, as if he's just confirmed a particularly depressing weather forecast. Town council pays $50 a month and you get to sleep in the back room. You also get to keep half the fines you collect from drunks and card cheats. You'll need it. Mostly for laundry and occasionally for burying any deputies foolish enough to work for you. The last one made it 3 weeks. Job's yours if you want it. The only other applicant was a one-eyed mule skinner who's wanted in Texas. There is no talk of justice, no mention of civic duty, no appeal to a higher purpose. It's a transaction, a grim piece of human accounting. This is how you become a sheriff in Dodge City. Not with a bang, but with a tired, desperate sigh. You take the job, because it is the only job left that you are qualified for. To stand between the chaos and the townsfolk, and absorb the violence of both. The idea that a Dodge City Sheriff's Day began with a dramatic sunrise showdown is a fantasy cooked up by people who never had to sleep on a lumpy straw mattress, in a room that smelled vaguely of desperation and unemptied spittoons. Holidays? Paid leave? Weekends? These were adorable concepts, as common for a Kansas lawman as a well-mannered poet at a dogfight. The railroad, the cattle, and the unquenchable thirst of several hundred armed men for cheap whiskey didn't take breaks, and therefore neither did you. A day began not with the sun, but with the rooster at the livery stable, a creature whose screeching seemed specifically calibrated to drill through your skull. It began before the first hint of dawn, usually with the sheriff swinging his legs off a cot that had more valleys than the entire state of Pennsylvania. The first conscious thought wasn't one of civic duty, but a dull, anatomical inventory of what new part of his body had decided to ache during the night. The first action was to light a lamp and survey his kingdom, a small, cramped office that doubled as a courthouse and tripled as a jail. The air was thick with the ghosts of yesterday's cigars, last night's sweat, and the faint, sour aroma of the single unfortunate soul currently snoring it off in the lone cell. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was a ritual of grim necessity. It was coffee, boiled on the potbelly stove until it was less a beverage and more a liquid form of punishment. Bitter, gritty, and hot enough to scald the cynicism right back onto your tongue. This was often accompanied by a hardtack biscuit, a foodstuff with the texture of a fossilized plate and the flavor of baked flour and regret. This wasn't fuel for a hero. It was ballast, a dense, joyless lump in your stomach to get you through the morning. And what a morning it was. The first official duty was never glamorous. It was often rousing the town drunk, a man known only as Sawdust Jed, and handing him a broom. His fine for sleeping in the street was to sweep out the office and the boardwalk in front of it, a task he performed with the slow, ponderous inefficiency of a glacier. While Jed redistributed the dust, the sheriff would begin his first patrol. This wasn't a noble stride down Front Street. It was a slow, meandering tour of petty grievances. First stop, Miller's Mercantile. Mr. Miller, a man whose face was permanently pinched with anxiety, would complain that one of the new drovers tried to pay for tobacco with a Mexican peso. The sheriff wouldn't make an arrest. He'd just sigh, walk over to the drover in question, and perform a 10-minute impromptu lesson on local currency that was met with a blank, confused stare. Next, a stop at the blacksmith's, where two freight drivers were on the verge of blows over who was next in line to have a wagon wheel fixed. Here, the sheriff acted less as a lawman and more as a tired parent separating two oversized bearded toddlers, his voice a monotone of pure weariness as he brokered a peace that would last approximately until his back was turned. The afternoon brought the true antagonist, the environment. The Kansas sun wasn't a gentle warmth. It was a physical weight, a celestial blacksmith's forge that hammered down on the town, bleaching the color from the wooden storefronts and baking the very air you breathed. It turned his dark wool vest into a portable sweat lodge and reflected off the alkali dust with a blinding, relentless glare. And the wind. Oh, the glorious wind. It wasn't a refreshing breeze. It was a constant, gritty harassment, a hot sandy exhalation from the lungs of some vast malevolent prairie deity. It picked up the fine dust from the street and the less fine dust from the nearby stockyards and blasted it into your eyes, your mouth, and the microscopic cracks in your soul. On a wet day, the dust transformed into the infamous Dodge City mud, a thick, greasy, boot-stealing substance of legendary tenacity. Crossing the street became a strategic campaign, a battle of attrition against a foe that was both liquid and solid, and smelled faintly of primordial despair. Then there was the sensory overload, a symphony of suffering played in the key of misery. The sounds were a constant, grating collage. The ceaseless, out-of-tune plinking of a piano from the Long Branch Saloon, a tune that had been murdered, resurrected, and murdered again since 10 in the morning. The rhythmic, head-splitting clang, clang, clang from the blacksmith's anvil. The low, mournful bellows of thousands of cattle in the pens, a sound of profound bovine sorrow. And beneath it all, the constant murmur of human voices, arguing, laughing, shouting, punctuated by the sudden sharp crack of a gunshot from the edge of town that would cause him to flinch every single time. Silence was not a commodity in Dodge City. The discomforts were his constant companions. The perpetual feeling of being grimy, a fine layer of dust and dried sweat forming a second skin, the chafing of his suspenders on his shoulders, the deep, persistent ache in his lower back from hours of walking on hard, uneven ground, the maddening itch from a flea he likely picked up from the jail cell mattress, a tiny tormentor he couldn't possibly address without publicly digging around in his own trousers. And the smells. My God, the smells. To call it an olfactory landscape is an insult to landscapes. It was an assault. The ode de misery that hung over Dodge was a rich, complex perfume. The base note was industrial-scale manure from the cattle pens, a thick, earthy foundation upon which all other scents were built. Layered upon this was the sharp, sour tang of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and vomit that wafted from the swinging doors of the dozen saloons. Add to that the acrid bite of coal smoke from the Santa Fe locomotive, the smell of frying lard from the Dodge House Hotel, the metallic scent of horse sweat and hot leather from the livery, and the ever-present overarching aroma of too many unwashed human beings crammed into one dusty bowl under a punishing sun. It was the smell of money being made, and it was utterly, breathtakingly foul. Yet amidst this tapestry of torment, there might be a fleeting moment of something else. It wasn't joy, but it was a close enough cousin. Maybe it was watching a truly massive herd of longhorns, thousands of them, flowing past the town, a river of muscle and horn, a sight of such raw, untamed power that it commanded a moment of genuine awe, or the quiet 5 minutes spent leaning against a shaded wall with a glass of lukewarm water, sharing a silent nod with Wyatt Earp or Bat Masterson. Not a conversation, just a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of their shared, absurd predicament. A brief island of professional calm in an ocean of amateur chaos. These were the 10% moments, the tiny gasps of air that made the other 90% of suffocation barely tolerable. As dusk fell, the symphony swelled to a crescendo. The day-long misery was merely a prelude to the nightly opera of idiocy. The cowboys, paid and primed, poured into the saloons. The piano music got louder, the laughter sharper, the arguments more frequent. The sheriff's job shifted from managing disputes to actively preventing small-scale warfare. He didn't relax. His entire being coiled into a state of tense readiness. His final patrol of the evening wasn't a walk. It was a tightrope act, a slow, deliberate movement through a world that had become dangerously unstable. He was no longer a peace officer. He was a bomb disposal technician, and the entire town was ticking. In the grand, heroic myth of the West, the lawman's tools are extensions of his own infallible will. His six-shooter is a loyal thunderclap in his hand, his badge a shield of pure justice, and his jail a fortress of civic order. The reality, as you might expect, was considerably less impressive and substantially more likely to get him killed. A sheriff's equipment wasn't a set of reliable aids. It was a collection of temperamental, high-stakes liabilities he was forced to depend on every single day. Let's start with the centerpiece of the legend, the revolver. Our sheriff likely carried a Colt single-action army, the so-called peacemaker. It's a beautiful piece of machinery, an icon of the age. But to think of it as a trusty, infallible companion is a dangerously romantic notion. It was less a loyal friend and more a moody, demanding business partner with a penchant for catastrophic failures at the least opportune times. For starters, the ammunition it fired was a small disaster in its own right. Black powder cartridges were notoriously corrosive, meaning if you didn't clean the weapon with obsessive, paranoid regularity, it would foul itself into a useless hunk of metal. And when fired, especially in the close confines of a dark, crowded saloon, that black powder produced a dense, sulphurous cloud of thick white smoke. The first shot was a thunderclap. The second, if you were lucky enough to get one off, was an educated guess aimed at a shadowy figure swimming in a wall of self-inflicted fog. Then there was the act of reloading. The cinematic hero fans his hammer and fires a dozen shots, then magically has a full cylinder again. Our sheriff, however, had to contend with the grim physics of 1878. After firing his 5 rounds, no sane man kept a live round under the hammer. He had to bring the hammer to half-cock, swing open the loading gate, and eject each spent casing one by one with a slow, deliberate ejector rod. Then, fumbling with loose cartridges from his belt, his hands shaking, slick with sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, he had to feed each new round into its chamber. It was a process that took an eternity under ideal conditions. In the middle of a gunfight, it was an engraved invitation to the afterlife. The gun didn't have the personality of a loyal dog. It had the personality of a ticking clock, and it always seemed to run out of time when you needed it most. Because of this, a savvy lawman often relied on a far less elegant but infinitely more persuasive tool, the double-barreled shotgun. Usually loaded with buckshot, the shotgun was the great equalizer. It required less precise aim, and the psychological impact of seeing both of its cavernous barrels pointed in your direction was often enough to end a confrontation before it began. It was the 19th century equivalent of a strongly worded diplomatic notice backed by nuclear weapons, but it too was a flawed instrument. You had 2 shots. That was it. 2 thunderous, room-clearing blasts, and then you were holding a very clumsy club while you fumbled to break the action and slide in 2 more shells. It was a tool for starting an argument with authority, or for ending one decisively, but it was useless for a prolonged conversation. And what of his other essential equipment? Let's consider the jail itself. The town lockup wasn't a granite-walled dungeon. More often, it was a hastily constructed wooden box, perhaps with a few iron bars retrofitted over a single window. The lock on the cell door was likely a cheap, mass-produced thing that a determined man with a piece of wire and a bit of patience could circumvent. The walls were thin, offering no soundproofing against the stream of vitriolic threats, drunken promises of revenge, and off-key singing that would emanate from any occupant. It wasn't a tool of secure incarceration. It was a suggestion box for bad ideas. The sheriff's constant, nagging fear was that the man he'd just risked his life to arrest would simply let himself out and come looking for him while he slept. Then there was the single most iconic and perhaps most useless piece of his entire kit, the badge. His state-of-the-art personal protective equipment consisted primarily of a flimsy piece of tin or nickel pinned to his vest. It offered about as much protection from a .45 caliber slug as a well-argued legal brief. The primary practical function of the star was not to repel bullets, but to provide a convenient, shiny target. It was a symbol of authority that was only recognized by the people who were never going to be a problem in the first place: the merchants, the hotel clerks, the law-abiding citizens. To the man he was actually paid to confront, the drunk, angry, and heavily armed cowboy who fundamentally did not believe in his authority, the badge was not a deterrent. It was a provocation. It was a dare. It was a small, glittering bullseye that said, "Here is the man who thinks he can tell you what to do. Please shoot here." This created a deeply dysfunctional, love-hate relationship with his tools, an unholy matrimony forged in shared misery and mutual disrespect. He had to depend on these flawed objects, and yet he knew they could betray him at any second. This complex bond was most evident in the nightly ritual of maintenance. He didn't clean his Colt out of affection. He cleaned it with the grim, focused paranoia of a priest tending a volatile idol. He would sit at his desk, methodically disassembling the weapon, wiping away every grain of black powder residue, oiling every moving part, not with a sense of pride, but with a deep, abiding fear of what would happen if he didn't. He cursed the gun when its cylinder stuck. He cursed the cheap lock on the jail door. But he also mended them with a grudging care, because they were his life. And yet, very, very rarely, there was a glimmer of something else. Not pride, but a grim, fleeting satisfaction. It was the moment in a tense standoff when he drew his revolver and the hammer cocked back with a clean, perfect, authoritative click. The moment the well-oiled cylinder spun without a hitch. The moment the shotgun's heavy thump against his shoulder was followed by the beautiful, beautiful sound of several belligerent men suddenly reconsidering their life choices. These weren't moments of joy. They were moments of profound animal relief. The relief of knowing that this time, this one time, the fickle, uncaring machines to which he had shackled his very existence had not failed him. It was the only positive reinforcement this unholy matrimony had to offer. The story of a Dodge City sheriff is so often framed by the dramatic, violent end that we forget about the slow, quiet, and infinitely more mundane ways the job was killing him. A bullet might end his career in a spectacular flash of smoke and thunder, but the life itself was a war of attrition, a relentless siege against his body and mind. If a man somehow managed to survive a year or two in this role, the person who walked away was a hollowed-out, used-up version of the one who first pinned on the star. By the time he reached what a pampered merchant might consider his prime, say, 35, our sheriff's body was already a walking museum of occupational hazards. His spine, from endless hours on his feet, jarring horseback rides, and sleeping on a cot designed by a sadist, likely resembled a gnarled juniper root. A deep, persistent ache in his lower back was his constant companion, a fire that never quite went out. His joints would sing arias of agony with every change in the weather, the cartilage worn thin from wrestling belligerent drunks and diving behind flimsy saloon tables. He'd rise in the morning with the creaks and groans of a man twice his age, his body protesting the day before it had even begun. And his hands, oh, his magnificent, ruined hands. They were not the nimble, steady instruments of a master gunfighter. They were a roadmap of pain. The knuckles were thick and often bruised from ill-advised attempts to reason with a man's jawbone. The palms were a crosshatch of scars from rope burns, splinters from shattered bar furniture, and the odd knife slash from a suspect who didn't appreciate being disarmed. They were less flesh and blood and more gnarled, callous tools, stiff in the morning, and trembling with exhaustion by night. The prairie sun, his constant overseer, had etched deep crow's feet around his eyes, and the perpetual glare off the alkali dust left him with a constant squint and vision that was getting fuzzier by the month. His ears, assaulted by the concussive blast of gunfire in close quarters, likely held a permanent, high-pitched ring, a private, maddening symphony only he could hear. All of this conspired to age him prematurely. The lines on his face weren't from laughter. They were from squinting, from worry, from pain. He was a man pickled in stress, and it showed in the gray streaks in his hair and the weary, stooped set of his shoulders. But it wasn't just the spectacular injuries or the slow decay of his skeleton that wore him down. Oh no, the environment itself was a prolific distributor of fascinating internal afflictions. The water, drawn from wells, often situated with breathtaking indifference to the location of the town's many outhouses and animal pens, was a biological adventure. Dysentery, the prairie quickstep, was a frequent and unwelcome visitor, a debilitating affliction that could leave a man weak, dehydrated, and utterly humiliated for days on end. The food was no better. A diet consisting of little more than hard biscuits, greasy fried meat, and coffee strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe left him in a state of chronic malnutrition. In the winter, the town became a petri dish for respiratory ailments. He'd spend his days moving between the biting cold outside and the superheated, oxygen-deprived air of saloons and offices, thick with a choking fog of coal smoke, cheap cigar fumes, and the collective exhalations of dozens of unwashed men. This inevitably led to the Dodge City hack, a deep, rattling cough that started in the fall and didn't leave until spring, if ever. And all of this was underpinned by a level of profound, bone-deep exhaustion that sleep barely dented. There was no catching up on rest. He was simply running a deficit of energy that grew larger with every passing day, leaving his mind foggy and his reactions a fraction of a second slower than they needed to be. While his body was engaged in this constant losing battle, his mind was fighting its own silent war. The most obvious enemy was fear. Not the heart-pounding terror of a full-blown gunfight, which was mercifully rare, but the ever-present low-grade hum of anxiety that was the soundtrack to his life. It was the knowledge that any man, on any given day, for any reason or for no reason at all, might decide to end his life. It was the tight knot in his stomach every time he pushed through a saloon's swinging doors. It was the hypervigilance that never switched off, the constant scanning of faces, hands, and doorways that made true relaxation an impossible luxury. Then there was the sheer, soul-crushing monotony. The myth is one of constant action, but the reality was endless repetition. The same drunks, the same arguments, the same petty disputes, day in and day out. He was the town's janitor of human problems. This cycle had a dehumanizing effect. He was no longer a man. He was a function, a badge, a symbol. This created a profound and inescapable isolation. He couldn't be friends with the cowboys. They were his antagonists. He couldn't be true friends with the respectable townsfolk, because he was the one they called to handle the things they wanted to pretend didn't exist. He saw the ugly side of everyone, and it built a wall around him that few could, or would, want to cross. His inner world likely became a fortress of stoic resignation, punctuated by flashes of impotent anger, or a bleak, weary cynicism. How did he cope? Not well. Perhaps his only real friend was a bottle of whiskey, the one thing that could temporarily deafen the ringing in his ears and dull the ache in his back. Perhaps his coping mechanism was a retreat into cold, professional detachment, a conscious effort to feel nothing that over time became an unconscious inability to feel much of anything at all. Or maybe, just maybe, there was a flicker of that 10% positivity in his grim adaptation. There might have been a dark, twisted pride in his own endurance. A quiet satisfaction in surviving another day, another week. It wasn't happiness, but it was a testament to his own resilience. A feeling of grim satisfaction after successfully de-escalating a situation that could have turned bloody. A quiet moment of peace on the street after the last cattle car has pulled away. These weren't moments of joy. They were simply the absence of misery. And for him, that was as good as it got. The most exhausting part of being the sheriff of Dodge City wasn't the threat of a bullet. It was the relentless, soul-grinding friction of dealing with human beings. Every single person, from the mayor who signed his paychecks to the cowboys he was paid to control, wanted something from him, and it was never something reasonable. He was not a hero to these people. He was a utility, a municipal tool meant to absorb all the town's jagged edges, and he was perpetually caught between the contradictory demands of fools, hypocrites, and angry men. His employers, the esteemed town council, were a prime example. These were the men who owned the saloons, the freight companies, and the general stores. They were men who spoke passionately about law and order in public meetings, but whose private motivations were singular: profit. They hired a sheriff not to enact justice, but to maintain a stable business environment. They wanted the trail-hardened cowboys to feel welcome enough to spend every last dollar of their wages, but to do so quietly and politely. This placed the sheriff in an impossible bind. Imagine a typical meeting with the mayor, a portly man whose face was a constant, sweaty mask of anxiety. He wouldn't call the sheriff into his office to congratulate him on a peaceful week. He'd call him in to complain. "Marshal," he'd begin, avoiding eye contact. "I've had a word from Mr. Johnson over at the Long Branch. He's pleased you disarmed that rowdy bunch from the Miller outfit last night. Very pleased. But he's less pleased that you saw fit to break 3 of his chairs and a perfectly good mirror in the process. That mirror was shipped all the way from St. Louis. Very costly." The sheriff would stand there, his back aching, and simply nod. He wasn't expected to explain that the alternative to a broken mirror was 3 dead cowboys and a burned-out saloon. He was expected to absorb the complaint. This was his true job, to be the town's official shock absorber. The council wanted him to be tough, but not so tough that he scared away customers. They wanted him to be present, but not so present that he reminded the free-spending drovers that rules existed. He was to be a ghost with a shotgun, a paradox in a tin star, and any failure to live up to this impossible standard was his and his alone. Then there were the respectable citizens, the very people he was theoretically protecting. Their gratitude was a rare and precious commodity, usually invisible to the naked eye. They wanted the criminal element purged, but they rarely agreed on who that was. The Ladies' Temperance Union would accost him on the street, demanding he shut down the dens of sin and moral decay, ignoring the fact that the town's entire economy was floating on a sea of whiskey. The merchant who publicly bemoaned the cowboys' crude behavior would privately sell them shoddy goods at a 100% markup, then demand the sheriff arrest the same men for loitering outside his store. Competence was the baseline expectation. Failure was a public spectacle. No one ever slapped him on the back and said, "Good work not letting the town descend into anarchy today." But if a horse was stolen or a window was broken, a line of aggrieved citizens would form outside his office before sunrise. His reward for successfully navigating a night of simmering violence without a single shot being fired was the continuation of his miserable existence into the next day. He wasn't seen as a skilled peacekeeper. He was a human tool, a renewable resource to be blamed when things went wrong and ignored when they went right. And what of his relationship with his own kind, his fellow sufferers? This refers, of course, to his deputies, the unfortunate souls he managed to hire to share his burden. Finding a good deputy in Dodge City was like trying to find a unicorn in a slaughterhouse. The pool of applicants was a shallow, murky puddle of the desperate, the naive, and the dangerously unstable. He'd get fresh-faced farm boys looking for dime novel glory who would run at the first sign of real trouble. He'd get grim-faced men with shifty eyes who were likely running from a warrant in another state. Hiring a deputy wasn't expanding his team, it was adopting a problem. This created a grim, complicated dynamic. On the one hand, a grim sort of camaraderie would flicker in the quiet, exhausted hours after a bad night. A shared bottle of whiskey, a conversation spoken in grunts and nods. These were the closest he came to friendship. It was a bond forged in shared agony, and the unspoken knowledge that they were the only 2 people in town who truly understood the stakes. But that fragile bond was always strained by brutal conditions. He had to constantly wonder, is this new man reliable? Will he have my back when the chips are down? Or is he just here for the meager paycheck until something better comes along? The psychological weight of being responsible for another man's life was immense. When he had to send a deputy into a volatile saloon, it was a sickening gamble. And when it went wrong, when a young man with a freshly pinned badge ended up on a slab at the undertaker's, the guilt was a physical weight. It was his job to write the letter home, to try and explain how a boy's dream of adventure ended in a squalid, pointless puddle of blood on a sawdust floor. Each time it happened, a part of him hardened, a new layer of cynical scar tissue forming over his soul. Yet, even in this human cesspool, a tiny 10% glimmer could be found. It was the rare, competent deputy, a man like a Wyatt Earp or a Bat Masterson. These weren't friendships in the traditional sense. They were professional alliances, built on a foundation of absolute, unspoken trust. It was the quiet confidence of walking into a dangerous situation, knowing the man beside you was as steady, as capable, and as weary as you were. It was communicating an entire plan with a single glance. This was the rarest of treasures, a peer who understood the job's ugly calculus. The presence of such a man didn't make the job good, but it made it bearable. And his absence, when he inevitably moved on, left a void that made the sheriff's isolation feel deeper and more profound than ever before. In a town like Dodge City, the word luxury had a very different meaning. It wasn't about silk sheets or fine wines. It was about a meal that didn't fight back, a roof that mostly didn't leak, and 5 consecutive minutes where no one was actively trying to set something, or someone, on fire. For our sheriff, these simple human necessities were not comforts to be enjoyed, but daily hurdles to be overcome. His life wasn't just Spartan. It was a deliberate, grinding assault on the very concept of well-being. First, let's embark on a culinary tour of despair and examine the sheriff's diet. The Dodge House Hotel might have boasted of serving the finest steaks in Kansas, but that was a universe away from our man's reality. His dining experience was less about savoring flavors and more about ingesting calories in the most efficient, joyless way possible. A typical day's menu was a monotonous litany of brown, beige, and despair. Breakfast, as we've noted, was a sacrament of suffering. Bitter, boiled over coffee, and a hardtack biscuit from a barrel that had likely been packed before the last presidential election. These weren't the fluffy, buttery biscuits of song and legend. These were dense, coarse, often gritty cakes of compacted sawdust, useful for throwing at rats or, in a pinch, consuming for sustenance. Lunch was not a civilized, seated affair. It was a tactical refueling operation. It might consist of a greasy meat pie bought from a street vendor, its crust of questionable integrity holding a mystery filling that was best not contemplated too deeply. Or perhaps it was a quick, solitary meal at the counter of the cheapest cafe in town. A plate of beans swimming in a thin, watery sauce, accompanied by a hunk of salt pork so tough it could have been used to risole his boots. The monotony was soul-crushing. It was beans, biscuits, and bacon, day in and day out, occasionally supplemented by a raw onion for a bit of texture, and a potent reminder that life could indeed always get a little worse. The water was a constant gamble, drawn straight from a well that was, in all likelihood, enjoying a close personal relationship with the runoff from the livery stable. It was tepid, often had a brownish tint, and tasted vaguely of dirt, metal, and regret. Every sip was an act of faith, a spin of the roulette wheel with dysentery as the grand prize. The alternative, a lukewarm beer or a shot of cheap whiskey, was safer from a bacterial standpoint, but came with the distinct disadvantage of dulling the senses, a luxury a man in his line of work could ill afford. This diet didn't fuel his labor. It merely staved off collapse. It was a constant, low-grade battle against malnutrition and disease, fought one joyless, repetitive meal at a time. Next, let's tour his living quarters, a space we shall generously refer to as home. His questionable shelter was the small back room of the marshal's office. This wasn't a cozy bachelor pad. It was a cramped, multi-purpose hole in the wall. The primary piece of furniture was a narrow cot, its thin straw mattress resting on wooden slats that had long since given up the ghost of providing comfort. Privacy was a concept as alien as a day off. His room was separated from the single jail cell by a thin wooden door, meaning he was never truly alone. He shared his home with every drunk, brawler, and lunatic he arrested, their snores, coughs, and whispered threats providing the constant soundtrack to his nights. Comfort and hygiene were laughable afterthoughts. His wash basin was a chipped ceramic bowl filled with the same questionable water he drank. His closet was a nail pounded into the wall, and he was not the sole occupant. He shared his domain with a thriving community of vermin. Rats scrabbled in the walls, Fleas held boisterous conventions in his bedding, and roaches patrolled the floorboards like tiny armored landlords. His shelter wasn't a sanctuary from the filth of the outside world. It was a concentrated, more intimate version of it. Finally, we arrive at the most precious and elusive luxury of all: rest. The notion that night was for uninterrupted sleep was a charming fairy tale he might tell children if he ever saw any. For the sheriff, the night was merely a continuation of his duties in the dark. If he was lucky enough to stretch out on his cot, his body itself often conspired against him, the chorus of his aching muscles and joints making deep sleep impossible. But even if his body was willing, the world was not. Sleep was a fragile truce, constantly shattered by the realities of his job. A drunken cowboy deciding to practice his shooting on street lamps at 2 a.m. would jolt him awake. The sudden, terrifying cry of "Fire!" from down the street would have him pulling on his boots before he was even fully conscious. An argument in the cell next door, escalating into a full-blown fight, required his immediate, weary intervention. He was, at all times, on call. He didn't sleep so much as he drifted in a state of suspended, hyper-vigilant animation, every nerve ending waiting for the next summons. The cumulative effect of this chronic sleep deprivation was devastating. It left him in a perpetual state of mental fog, slowing his thoughts, fraying his temper, and dulling his instincts. In a job where a split-second decision could mean the difference between life and death, this exhaustion was not just a discomfort, it was a mortal danger. It was a debt that compounded daily, with his own life as the collateral. The financial arrangement for a town sheriff was a masterwork of lopsided economics. The concept of a regular payday involving a hefty sack of clinking currency was, for our lawman, a delightful fiction. His income was a precarious and often contradictory stream of a meager salary and a deeply flawed fee system, all of it subject to the whims of his employers and the chaotic local economy. His base pay, provided by the town council, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 to $75 a month. In an era when a farmhand might make $1 a day, this sounds almost reasonable, until you factor in the realities of a boomtown. That salary wasn't being spent in a quiet, stable Midwestern town. It was being spent in Dodge City, an island of commerce in the middle of the prairie where every single item was shipped in at great expense. A simple meal cost more. A box of cartridges cost more. A new pair of boots cost more. After paying for his own ammunition, maintaining his gear, and buying his wretched food, that monthly salary evaporated like a puddle in the July sun. It wasn't a wage. It was a subsidy for his own continued, miserable existence. It was calculated to be just about enough to keep him from inconveniently dying, or worse, quitting. The real cornerstone of this shaky financial structure was the fee system. This was the carrot dangled in front of the stick of his base salary. For every arrest he made for disturbing the peace, for being drunk and disorderly, for carrying a firearm within town limits, he was entitled to keep a portion of the fine, usually half. On paper, this sounds like a lucrative opportunity for a proactive lawman. In reality, it was a perverse incentive structure designed to drive a man insane. To make a living, he needed to make arrests. But the very men most likely to be arrested, the free-spending Texas cowboys, were the engine of the town's economy. This created a constant, unwinnable conflict of interest. If he was too zealous in his duties, arresting every rowdy drover who stepped out of line, he'd face the wrath of the saloon owners and merchants who saw their customers being hauled away. The mayor would remind him that Dodge City had a reputation to uphold as a cowboy-friendly town. But if he was too lenient, his own income would plummet, leaving him unable to afford his next box of beans. He had to walk a razor's edge, enforcing the law just enough to prevent total anarchy, but not so much that it interfered with commerce. And deductions, Oh, the creative accounting a town council could employ. That mirror his prisoner broke? The cost might just find its way out of his monthly pay. The door splintered during an arrest? That was a municipal expense he might be expected to share. He was also often responsible for paying any deputies out of his own pocket, turning his meager earnings into an even smaller pittance. This brings us to the grand cosmic irony of his position. Our sheriff stood guard over a river of wealth. A single cattle herd driven up from Texas could be worth tens of thousands of dollars. The railroad, the freight companies, the cattle buyers, the saloon keepers, they were all moving mountains of cash. He was the lifeblood of this entire operation. He was the sole guarantor of the peace and stability required for this commerce to even exist. Without him and the fragile order he represented, Dodge City would cease to be a profitable cow town and would revert to being a lawless, violent patch of dirt that no sane investor would touch. And for this pivotal role in the American capitalist experiment, for personally ensuring the machinery of profit could churn away, he was rewarded with a social status somewhere between a stray dog and a broken wagon wheel. He physically moved and protected mountains of wealth, yet his own pockets would have contained nothing but lint, a few spare cartridges, and shattered dreams. He was the essential, overlooked, and perpetually underpaid cog in a great machine that enriched everyone but him. His already precarious existence was further buffeted by the whims of gods and kings, or in his case, the whims of the cattle market and the railroad tycoons. His income was directly tethered to the seasonal ebb and flow of the cattle drives. In the late summer, when the herds arrived, Dodge was a whirlwind of activity. The town was flooded with men and money. This was the feast season, where he might make dozens of arrests in a week, his fee-based income swelling. Of course, this also meant his workload and his risk of being killed skyrocketed, but at least he could afford to eat. Then, as the last herds were sold and shipped east, the famine began. The cowboys vanished. The saloons grew quiet. The town settled into its sleepy off-season torpor. For the sheriff, this meant the river of fines dried up almost completely. His salary remained the same, but his ability to supplement it was gone. He was left to pace the quiet, dusty streets, his income slashed, waiting for the next season, the next influx of trouble and cash. His financial well-being was utterly dependent on the very chaos he was paid to control, a paradox that would be funny if it weren't so tragic. If you were to ask our sheriff what the worst part of his job was, he probably wouldn't say the threat of gunfire or the miserable food. He'd likely pause, stare at a fixed point on the horizon, and after a long, weary silence, say something about tomorrow, because the deepest, most insidious horror of his existence was the ironclad certainty that tomorrow would be exactly the same as today. The concept of finishing for the day was a quaint notion, a charming fairy tale for people with normal lives. His work was never completed. It was merely interrupted by short, anxious periods of what he generously called sleep. This wasn't a job of progress. It was a job of perpetual grinding maintenance on a machine designed to break down. Consider the fundamental cycle of his duties. A trail herd arrives. The cowboys get paid. They descend upon the saloons. They get drunk. Fights break out. The sheriff intervenes. He disarms a few, cracks a few heads, and inevitably has to drag one or two of the worst offenders to his jail cell. This feels like a conclusion, an endpoint, but it's a lie. The arrest is merely the beginning of the next cycle. He has to listen to the man rant, rave, or vomit all night. The next morning, he has to process him, act as the de facto judge, levy a $5 fine the man likely can't pay, and then personally escort him to the edge of town with a stern warning not to come back. This entire exhausting ordeal achieves precisely nothing, because the next week, a new herd will arrive with a new batch of cowboys, and he will do it all over again. The names and faces might change, but the script remains identical. The road to Dodge City flowed in two directions, and so, conveniently, did his misery. It brought trouble in, he processed it, and he sent it back out, all while knowing that the source was endless. He wasn't solving a problem. He was a human filtration system for a river of chaos, and the river never stopped flowing. His to-do list wasn't a series of tasks to be checked off. It was a circle. The list was simply, suffer, repeated infinitely. This feeling of being trapped was not just psychological, it was systemic. His life was tethered to the grand, indifferent rhythms of the seasons and the cattle trade. He was a prisoner of the calendar. Summer and fall brought the herds, and with them came the frantic, violent, high-stakes work that wore down his body and soul. This was the season of noise, blood, and fear. Then, as winter approached, the cattlemen left, and the town sank into a quiet, frozen torpor. But this wasn't a respite. It was merely a different kind of misery. The violent chaos was replaced by a quiet, impoverished boredom. The flood of fee-based income dried up, leaving him to subsist on his meager salary. He would spend these long, cold months pacing the empty streets, the silence almost as unnerving as the noise it replaced. His life was a pendulum, swinging between frantic terror and bleak stagnation, with no happy medium in between. There was no escape from this hamster wheel. To quit would be to admit utter defeat. As we've established, a man didn't take this job because he had a wealth of options. He took it because it was the last, desperate handhold on the cliff face of society. To let go would be to fall into the abyss of unemployment and vagrancy, a fate arguably worse than his current one. So he stayed. He was a cog in the great dusty machine of the American West, destined to turn until he broke. He ran his patrol. He broke up the fights. He cleaned his gun, not to get anywhere, but simply to survive another rotation on the great grinding wheel. It would be an insult to the profound depth of his suffering to suggest that our sheriff's life contained anything approaching joy. That word implies a lightness and warmth that had no place in his world. Yet even in the deepest, darkest pit of daily misery, the human spirit, that stubborn and irrational weed, can sometimes find the tiniest, most improbable crack of light. These weren't moments of happiness. They were tiny, gasping breaths in an ocean of suffocation. There might be a grim flicker of professional pride after a particularly difficult job was executed perfectly. Imagine him walking into the Long Branch Saloon, where 4 members of a notoriously rough trail outfit are standing at the bar, refusing to surrender their firearms. The air is thick with tension. Instead of drawing his weapon, he simply stands there, his face a mask of utter weariness, and speaks in a low, quiet voice, laying out for them in meticulous anatomical detail exactly how their evening will end if they force his hand. There's a long, tense silence, and then, one by one, they unbuckle their gun belts and place them on the bar. The sheriff doesn't smile. He doesn't gloat. But as he gathers the weapons, there is a deep internal flicker of grim satisfaction. He has imposed his will on chaos, not with violence, but with the sheer heavy weight of his own exhaustion and credibility. Sometimes the affirmation came from a shared moment of gallows humor, a quiet drink with a competent deputy after a night that nearly got both of them killed. The deputy might raise his glass and mutter, "To another night of enriching the undertaker." The sheriff might reply with a dry, "He's the only man in this town who appreciates our work." They would share a laugh, not a joyful sound, but a harsh barking noise, a brief, cynical acknowledgement of their shared absurd reality. It was a joke so dark it would make a vulture wince, and it was the closest thing to camaraderie he had. These were the fleas of joy found in a mange-ridden existence. The grudging, much-obliged marshal from a cattle baron after the sheriff finds his stolen horse. the rare, quiet nod of genuine respect from a fellow lawman passing through on the train. A letter from a mother in Ohio, thanking him for putting her foolish son on that train home instead of letting him die in a gunfight. These weren't rewards. They weren't payment for his suffering. They were simply tiny, unexpected affirmations that he was in fact still a human being, and that his thankless, endless task occasionally, almost accidentally, resulted in something other than more misery. These moments didn't make the cycle stop, but they made the next rotation fractionally more bearable. There are two ways a Dodge City sheriff's career typically ended. The first was abrupt, loud, and bloody. A final, violent punctuation mark at the end of a short, brutal sentence. This, in a strange way, was the merciful exit. The second was quieter, slower, and infinitely more humiliating. It was the long, grinding process of becoming obsolete. It was the slow, dawning realization that the very job that had consumed your youth was now about to cast you aside like a worn-out tool. The town, like a cruel moneylender, always collects its debts, and our sheriff's account was long past due. The first intimations of the end were small, private betrayals by his own body. A hesitation in his drawing hand, a tremor he couldn't control, a sudden slowness in his step when chasing a fleeing suspect, the younger man pulling away with an ease that felt like a personal insult. That chronic rattling cough that had been his winter companion now lingered deep into the summer. The arthritis that had once been a dull ache in his knuckles now made gripping the handle of his Colt an exercise in pure agony. He started finding himself out of breath after climbing the single flight of stairs to the judge's chambers. These weren't just aches and pains anymore. They were notifications of his own impending failure. The real, soul-chilling moment of truth often came during a crisis. A brawl spills out of the Alhambra saloon, a whirlwind of fists and fury. In his prime, he would have waded into the center of it, a whirlwind of his own, ending it with decisive, practiced force. Now he hesitates for a fraction of a second. His body doesn't respond with the same explosive speed. He misjudges a step, and a glancing blow sends him stumbling. A younger deputy, hired just a few months ago, moves past him and handles the situation with a brutal efficiency that the sheriff himself once possessed. The fight is over, but for the sheriff, the true damage has been done. In that moment, he sees it. And worse, he knows everyone else sees it too. He starts to notice a change in the way the town council looks at him. The mayor's gaze, which used to hold a measure of grudging respect, now passes over him with a new kind of assessment. The cold, calculating look of a man evaluating a worn-out tool. He is no longer an asset. He is a liability. A man a step too slow in a town this fast is a danger to himself, to the public, and most importantly, to business. They don't thank him for his years of service. They don't offer him a gold watch. There was no pension plan for a town marshal, no concept of a dignified retirement. When you could no longer pull your oar, you were simply cut loose. You became redundant, a mouth to feed without the hands to earn it. The grim future stretched out before him. A cheap room in a boarding house, a life spent nursing a bottle and boring strangers with stories of his glory days, until he ended up in a pauper's grave. Faced with this terrifying prospect, he does what any man in his position would do. He finds a replacement. Not for himself, not yet. But he starts looking for a new deputy, a younger man who can be the legs, fists, and speed that he no longer possesses. He is not looking for a partner. He is looking for his own successor. This is how the torch of misery gets passed. He doesn't have a son to whom he can bequeath his aching back, so he finds a surrogate. He sees a young man step off the train, full of naive confidence and a cheap suit, looking for adventure. The sheriff sees him and feels a complex, bitter brew of emotions churning in his gut. There is, First and foremost, a grim necessity. He needs this boy's strength to survive. But it's immediately followed by a wave of profound guilt, knowing he is essentially shackling this bright-eyed kid to the same leaking barge of a life that has crippled him. The training process is a masterclass in pragmatic cruelty. He barks at the boy, just as his long-departed predecessor once barked at him. He doesn't teach with patient lectures on the law. He teaches by shoving the boy into the deep end of Dodge City's cesspool and watching to see if he learns to swim. He'll make the new deputy be the first one through the saloon doors. He'll have him break up the card game that's about to turn violent. After the boy inevitably makes a mistake, the sheriff won't console him. He'll dissect the failure in cold, clinical detail. "You hesitated," he'll say in a flat voice. "You looked at his eyes instead of his hands. That's how you get killed. Don't do it again." The boy, in turn, looks at this grizzled, broken-down legend with a confusing mix of emotions. He sees the hero of the stories he read back east, but he also sees the terrible price of that heroism. He feels the sting of the old man's rebukes, but he also slowly, painfully begins to understand the lessons behind them. He watches the sheriff's trembling hands, his weary eyes, his profound isolation, and he has the dawning, dreadful understanding that this is his glorious inheritance. He is looking at his own future. The torch isn't being passed in a triumphant, heroic moment. It's a grim, quiet transaction in a dusty office, where one man buys himself a little more time by selling another man's future. The great figures of the American West are carved into the stone of our national mythology. Railroad barons who tamed the continent with iron and steam. Cattle kings whose empires sprawled across millions of acres. Famous gunslingers whose names became legend, their stories polished and sold for a dime. These are the colossal statues in the landscape of our memory, their achievements celebrated, their names immortalized. But beneath the shadow of every colossal statue, in the dust of every ghost town, lies the unrecorded sweat and sinew of countless forgotten men, like our Dodge City sheriff. He wore no crown. He built no empires. His name does not appear in the laudatory biographies of the age. His greatest achievements were not victories, but disasters averted. His legacy is not written in stone, but in the silence of a gunfight that never happened, in the continuation of a business that didn't burn down, in the survival of a town that, by all rights, should have consumed itself in a bonfire of greed and violence. He was the unseen ant, laboring tirelessly to build the mountain, only for others to plant their flag on its summit and claim it as their own. Without his relentless, monotonous toil, the lifeblood of that frontier civilization, the trade routes, the cattle markets, the fragile beginnings of civic order, would have failed. He was the thankless human infrastructure upon which the celebrated taming of the West was actually built. He was the boring, necessary chapter that everyone skips to get to the good parts, forgetting that without that chapter, the rest of the book makes no sense. His name, like the names of so many who held his office, has long since dissolved into the Kansas dust. No statues were raised in his honor, but his legacy is everywhere, hidden in plain sight. It's in the very existence of a town like Dodge City today, a place that survived its own chaotic birth. It's in the transition from a lawless frontier camp to a stable community where one could raise a family without the daily fear of a stray bullet. His impact is in the eventual establishment of schools, churches, and brick-and-mortar stores, the very things that were made possible because he and men like him held the line against anarchy long enough for roots to take hold. He was the anonymous current, the motive force that allowed a violent, transient settlement to begin its slow, painful evolution into a town. He didn't just witness history, he physically moved it, one drunken cowboy at a time. He dragged it, kicking and screaming, toward a future it didn't want and didn't believe it needed. The great irony is that his ultimate success was his own obsolescence. The more effectively he did his job, the more civilized the town became, and the less it needed a man like him. A hard, cynical tool, forged for a harder, more cynical time. So the next time you watch a classic Western and marvel at the stoic lawman standing tall against the forces of chaos, spare a thought for the forgotten sheriff of the real Dodge City. Remember the filth, the exhaustion, the miserable pay, and the profound isolation. He sought no glory and received none. He was not a hero in shining armor. He was a weary, underpaid, and deeply flawed man, tasked with an impossible job in an impossible place. Yet, in his unceasing labor, in his stubborn endurance against a tide of human folly, he was more than just a sufferer. He was a fundamental part of the great, unseen engine that powered a civilization. He was the brake on the runaway train of frontier excess. He was the levee holding back the flood of chaos, even as the water seeped through and soaked him to the bone. He wasn't just a drop of water in the vast, dusty ocean of the prairie. He was its very will to cohere, to connect, to build. His name is forgotten, but his collective contribution, the stability he bled for, the order he manufactured from chaos, is eternal.